August 9, 1969. Four people are brutally murdered in a mansion on Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon. The victims include one of Hollywood's brightest stars, a coffee heiress, a celebrity hairstylist, and an 18-year-old student. The next night, two more people are killed across town in an even more savage attack. By the time police connect these murders to a hippie cult leader named Charles Manson, the entire world has changed forever. But what if I told you that everything you think you know about the Manson murders is wrong? What if the real motive wasn't race war or random violence, but something far more specific and terrifying? What if Sharon Tate and the other victims weren't chosen randomly, but were targeted because they knew something that powerful people in Hollywood needed to stay buried? And what if Charles Manson wasn't the mastermind, but just a convenient patsy in a conspiracy that reaches the highest levels of the entertainment industry? If you've ever suspected that there's more to famous crimes than what makes it into the history books, smash that like button and subscribe, because we're about to expose the real truth behind Hollywood's most infamous murders and the cover-up that's lasted over 50 years. The official story of the Manson murders has been told countless times in books, movies, and documentaries. Charles Manson, a failed musician and career criminal, convinced a group of young followers that he was Jesus Christ reborn. He filled their heads with apocalyptic visions of a coming race war called Helter Skelter that would destroy civilization and leave him in control of the survivors. When the race war failed to materialize on its own, Manson decided to start it himself by murdering wealthy white people and making it look like Black Panthers were responsible. That's the story that was presented at trial, and it's the story that most people still believe today. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi wrote a best-selling book about the case that cemented this narrative in popular culture. Hollywood made movies that reinforced the image of Manson as a charismatic cult leader who convinced his followers to commit murder for apocalyptic reasons. But if you look closely at the evidence, if you follow the money, and if you pay attention to what the prosecutors didn't want you to know, a very different picture emerges. The Manson murders weren't random acts of violence committed by a deluded cult. They were targeted assassinations carried out to protect a network of corruption, blackmail, and illegal activities that connected some of the most powerful people in Hollywood. The late 1960s were a time of massive upheaval in the entertainment industry. The old studio system that had controlled Hollywood since the 1930s was collapsing under pressure from independent filmmakers, changing social attitudes, and new financial realities. This transition created enormous opportunities for profit, but it also created vulnerabilities that criminal organizations were quick to exploit. Drug trafficking had become a major source of financing for independent films and a way for established figures to maintain their influence in a changing industry. Cocaine was flowing through Hollywood parties like champagne, and the profits were being used to finance movies, buy political influence, and control careers. But the drug trade also created blackmail opportunities and dangerous dependencies that could destroy lives and careers. High-end prostitution networks served not just as entertainment for wealthy clients, but as intelligence-gathering operations that provided compromising material on politicians, executives, and stars. The people who ran these networks had access to the most intimate secrets of Hollywood's elite, and they used this information to control decisions worth millions of dollars. Money laundering operations disguised as film investments allowed organized crime figures to clean their profits while gaining influence in legitimate businesses. Tax avoidance schemes routed through offshore accounts enabled wealthy individuals to hide their assets while avoiding legal obligations. And blackmail operations based on sexual compromises, drug dependencies, and financial crimes gave criminal networks enormous power over people who appeared to be legitimate business leaders. Sharon Tate had stumbled into this world through her marriage to Roman Polanski, one of Hollywood's most successful and controversial directors. Polanski was deeply involved in the underground economy that was financing much of the industry's new wave cinema. His films were being funded through drug money, his parties were serving as networking events for criminal enterprises, and his personal activities were creating vulnerabilities that dangerous people were eager to exploit. But Polanski wasn't just a passive participant in these networks. He was documenting everything he saw and heard, taking photographs and making recordings that could serve as insurance against the people he was working with. He understood that his involvement in illegal activities made him vulnerable to prosecution or violence, and he was building an archive of compromising material that could protect him if his criminal associates ever tried to eliminate him. Sharon Tate began to understand what her husband was really involved in during the months before her murder. She discovered evidence of drug trafficking, money laundering, and blackmail operations that involved some of the biggest names in Hollywood. She learned about the connections between the entertainment industry and organized crime, and she realized that her own career and social life had been shaped by these criminal networks. Initially, Sharon tried to convince Roman to extract himself from these dangerous relationships. She understood that their involvement with criminal organizations put their family at risk, and she wanted them to find legitimate ways to finance their careers and social activities. But Roman was too deeply embedded in the networks to simply walk away, and he was too dependent on the profits and protection they provided. When Sharon realized that Roman wasn't going to change his behavior, she began making her own plans to expose what she had learned. She started copying documents, recording conversations, and gathering evidence that could be used to expose the criminal networks that controlled much of Hollywood. She wasn't planning to go to the police immediately, but she wanted to have enough evidence to protect herself and her unborn child if the situation became more dangerous. What Sharon didn't realize was that her activities were being monitored by the same networks she was investigating. The people who controlled the drug trade, prostitution operations, and money laundering schemes had extensive surveillance capabilities, and they quickly became aware that she was gathering evidence against them. They also realized that her evidence could destroy careers, lead to federal prosecutions, and cost them millions of dollars in illegal profits. Jay Sebring, the celebrity hairstylist who was killed alongside Sharon Tate, was even more deeply involved in Hollywood's criminal underground. His hair salon served as a front for drug-dealing operations, and his client relationships gave him access to compromising information about some of the most powerful people in the entertainment industry. Sebring had been using his position to gather blackmail material for years, and he had accumulated enough evidence to destroy dozens of careers and expose criminal activities worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Sebring's operation was sophisticated and well protected. He had financial backing from organized crime figures, political protection from corrupt officials, and technological support from intelligence agencies that were using his information for their own purposes. But Sebring had become greedy and reckless, demanding larger payments for his silence and threatening to expand his operations in ways that would attract unwanted attention from federal law enforcement. The criminal networks that had been paying Sebring for his silence realized that he was becoming more of a liability than an asset. His demands for money were cutting into their profits, his threats to expose clients were creating security risks, and his plans for expansion were threatening to bring down law enforcement attention on all of their operations. They decided that Sebring needed to be eliminated before he could cause more damage to their enterprises. Abigail Folger, the coffee heiress, who was also murdered at Cielo Drive, represented a different kind of threat to Hollywood's criminal networks. She was using her family's fortune to support social justice causes that were getting too close to exposing the connections between the entertainment industry and organized crime. Her funding was supporting investigative journalists, civil rights activists, and political reformers who were asking uncomfortable questions about how Hollywood really operated. Folger had also become involved with anti-war activists who were investigating the connections between the entertainment industry and military contractors. She had discovered that some of the same criminal networks that controlled drug trafficking and prostitution in Hollywood were also involved in arms dealing and had financial interests in continuing the Vietnam War. Her efforts to expose these connections made her a target for elimination by people who had enormous financial stakes in maintaining the status quo. Wojciech Frykowski, Folger's boyfriend and another victim at Cielo Drive, was a Polish writer and filmmaker who had been documenting the criminal networks that operated in Hollywood for a book he was planning to publish. Frykowski had insider access to the drug trafficking operations because he was a user and small-time dealer himself, but he had been secretly recording conversations and copying documents that revealed the scope and connections of the criminal enterprises. Frykowski's book would have exposed specific names, financial transactions, and operational details that could have led to federal investigations and prosecutions of major figures in the entertainment industry. He had evidence of money laundering operations worth hundreds of millions of dollars, drug trafficking networks that supplied much of Hollywood's cocaine and marijuana, and blackmail schemes that controlled the careers of major stars and executives. The criminal networks knew about Frykowski's book project because they had informants throughout the industry who reported on potential threats. They had tried to buy his silence and his evidence, but Frykowski was motivated by more than money. He believed that exposing the corruption in Hollywood was important for social and political reasons, and he wasn't willing to be bought off or intimidated into silence. Stephen Parent, the 18-year-old who was killed when he happened to visit the Cielo Drive house that night, wasn't just an innocent victim who was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Parent had been working as a courier and informant for some of the same criminal networks that the other victims were threatening to expose. He had been delivering money, drugs, and messages between different criminal organizations, and he had accumulated knowledge about their operations that made him a security risk. Parent had also been recruited by federal law enforcement agencies as an informant, and he was providing information about drug trafficking and money laundering operations in exchange for immunity from prosecution for his own criminal activities. The criminal networks had discovered Parent's cooperation with law enforcement, and they realized that he could provide testimony that would corroborate the evidence that the other victims had been gathering. The decision to eliminate Parent along with the other victims served multiple purposes. It prevented him from providing testimony that could support prosecutions based on evidence gathered by Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojciech Frykowski. It also sent a message to other potential informants about what would happen to them if they cooperated with law enforcement investigations of criminal activities in Hollywood. The murders at the LaBianca house the following night were equally targeted and strategic. Leno LaBianca wasn't just a businessman who happened to be selected randomly for murder. He had been operating money laundering schemes for various criminal organizations, but he had become unreliable and was showing signs of wanting to cooperate with federal authorities who were investigating organized crime activities in Los Angeles. LaBianca's grocery store chain and other business interests were being used to wash money from drug trafficking, prostitution, and other illegal activities. He had detailed knowledge of financial transactions that could expose the criminal networks and their connections to legitimate businesses throughout Southern California. But LaBianca had been drinking heavily and talking carelessly about his criminal activities, creating security risks that his criminal associates couldn't tolerate. Rosemary LaBianca, Leno's wife, was a real estate agent who had been facilitating property transactions that were used to hide illegal assets and provide operational bases for criminal activities. She had helped criminal organizations purchase properties that were used as drug laboratories, brothels, and safe houses. She had also been involved in real estate fraud schemes that allowed criminals to hide their identities and avoid law enforcement surveillance. But Rosemary had become nervous about her involvement in these activities and was talking about withdrawing from the criminal enterprises and possibly providing information to law enforcement about the properties and transactions she had facilitated. Her knowledge of real estate transactions could have provided law enforcement with a roadmap to criminal operations throughout Los Angeles and beyond. The decision to murder both LaBiancas was made to eliminate their potential testimony and to seize control of their business operations before they could be used to provide evidence to law enforcement. The criminal networks also wanted to send a message to other business partners about what would happen to them if they tried to withdraw from criminal enterprises or cooperate with law enforcement. Charles Manson wasn't the mastermind behind these murders. He was a small-time criminal and failed musician who had been recruited by much more powerful people to serve as a frontman for operations that were being planned and financed by major criminal organizations. The Manson family wasn't a spontaneous hippie cult that turned violent. It was a carefully constructed cover operation that allowed the real perpetrators to carry out targeted assassinations while creating a false narrative that would misdirect law enforcement attention. Manson had been identified as a potential patsy because of his criminal background, his history of mental instability, and his ability to attract and control followers. Criminal organizations had been monitoring him for months before the murders, studying his behavior and his relationships to determine how he could be used to serve their purposes. The process of turning Manson into a patsy involved providing him with money, drugs, and other resources that allowed him to maintain his lifestyle and attract followers. It also involved feeding him information and ideas that could be used to construct a plausible motive for the murders that would hide the real reasons why the victims had been targeted. The helter-skelter narrative wasn't something that Manson invented on his own. It was constructed by intelligence professionals who understood how to create believable cover stories for covert operations. The racial war theme was chosen because it provided a motive that seemed consistent with the social tensions of the late 1960s, while directing attention away from the criminal enterprises that had actually ordered the murders. Manson was coached on how to present this narrative and how to behave in ways that would make him seem like a charismatic cult leader who had convinced his followers to commit murder for apocalyptic reasons. He was provided with books, recordings, and other materials that would support the cover story and make it seem like the murders were the result of his personal obsessions rather than carefully planned business decisions. The other members of the Manson family who carried out the actual murders were also carefully selected and prepared for their roles. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Charles Tex Watson, and Leslie Van Houten weren't just random hippies who got caught up in Manson's influence. They were individuals with specific psychological profiles that made them suitable for manipulation and control. These individuals were subjected to systematic psychological conditioning that involved drugs, sleep deprivation, sexual manipulation, and other techniques designed to break down their individual personalities and make them compliant with orders from authority figures. The conditioning process was supervised by professionals who had experience with mind control techniques developed by intelligence agencies for use in covert operations. The actual murders were carried out according to detailed plans that had been developed by professionals with experience in assassination and covert operations. The timing, methods, and locations were all chosen to maximize the impact of the crimes while minimizing the risks of exposure for the people who had ordered them. The weapons used in the murders were chosen to create maximum psychological impact rather than for efficiency or convenience. The brutal and seemingly random nature of the violence was designed to create fear and confusion that would make it difficult for investigators to understand the real motives for the crimes. The positioning of bodies and the messages left at crime scenes were all carefully planned to support the cover narrative and misdirect attention away from the real perpetrators. The helter-skelter and death to pigs graffiti wasn't spontaneous expression by crazed killers. It was deliberate psychological warfare designed to create specific impressions in the minds of investigators and the public. If you're starting to understand how sophisticated this operation really was, make sure to subscribe and let me know in the comments what you think about these revelations. Because what I'm about to tell you about the investigation and cover-up will prove that law enforcement knew about the real conspiracy from the beginning, but actively worked to hide it from the public. The Los Angeles Police Department's investigation of the Manson murders was compromised from the very beginning by the involvement of officers who were connected to the same criminal networks that had ordered the killings. Several detectives assigned to the case had been receiving payments from organized crime figures and were more interested in covering up the real conspiracy than in solving the murders. Detective Paul Whiteley, one of the first investigators on the scene at Cielo Drive, had been working as an informant for federal agencies that were using Hollywood's criminal networks for their own purposes. His job wasn't to solve the murders, but to ensure that the investigation didn't expose activities that were considered sensitive to national security interests. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had been aware of the criminal networks operating in Hollywood for years, but instead of prosecuting them, the FBI had been using them as sources of information and as cover for their own covert operations. The drug trafficking and money laundering operations provided convenient ways for intelligence agencies to fund activities that couldn't be supported through official budgets. The prostitution and blackmail networks were valuable sources of intelligence about political figures, foreign diplomats, and business leaders who might be useful to American intelligence operations. The FBI and CIA had been protecting these criminal enterprises because they served important strategic purposes that were considered more valuable than law enforcement objectives. When the murders occurred, federal agencies immediately understood that the victims had been killed because they posed threats to criminal networks that were valuable intelligence assets. The agencies couldn't allow the real motives for the murders to be exposed because that would have revealed their own connections to the criminal organizations and compromised ongoing intelligence operations. The decision was made at the highest levels of federal law enforcement to ensure that the Manson investigation would focus on the cult narrative rather than on the real conspiracy. This required extensive coordination between federal agencies, local law enforcement, prosecutors, and media organizations to maintain a consistent false narrative while suppressing evidence that contradicted the official story. The crime scene at Cielo Drive was deliberately contaminated to destroy evidence that might have pointed to the real perpetrators. Important physical evidence was removed from the scene before it could be properly documented or analyzed. Witnesses were coached on what to say and what not to say to investigators and reporters. One of the most important pieces of evidence that was suppressed was a collection of photographs that had been taken at the Cielo Drive house in the weeks before the murders. These photographs showed several prominent Hollywood figures and political officials engaged in illegal activities, including drug use, sexual crimes, and financial transactions related to money laundering operations. The photographs had been taken by a private investigator who had been hired by one of the victims to document activities at the house. The investigator had been working with federal law enforcement agencies as an informant, and the photographs were intended to provide evidence for possible future prosecutions of the criminal networks. But when the murders occurred, the photographs became too dangerous to be used as evidence because they would have exposed the connections between the victims and the criminal networks, revealing the real motives for the killings. The photographs were confiscated by federal agents and have never been released to the public or even acknowledged to exist. The private investigator who took the photographs died in a suspicious car accident just 3 weeks after the murders. The official investigation concluded that the accident was caused by mechanical failure, but the investigator's family and colleagues believed that he had been murdered to prevent him from revealing what he knew about the real reasons for the Cielo Drive killings. Another crucial piece of evidence that was covered up was a series of financial records showing large payments that had been made to members of the Manson family in the weeks and months before the murders. These payments came from accounts that were controlled by major figures in the entertainment industry and organized crime, proving that the family was being funded and directed by people with significant resources and influence. The payments weren't just for drugs or other illegal goods that the family might have been selling. They were specific payments for services that were described in coded language in the financial records. Some of the payments were made after the murders, clearly indicating that they were compensation for carrying out the killings rather than for other criminal activities. But perhaps the most damaging evidence that was suppressed was a collection of audio recordings made by federal surveillance operations that captured conversations between Charles Manson and several Hollywood executives and organized crime figures in which they discussed the planned murders and the specific reasons why each victim needed to be eliminated. These recordings were made as part of ongoing FBI and CIA surveillance of suspected criminal activities in Hollywood. The conversations took place over several months before the murders and reveal a level of planning and coordination that completely contradicts the official narrative of spontaneous cult violence. In the recordings, Manson can be heard taking detailed instructions about how the murders should be carried out, what evidence should be left at the crime scenes, and how the family members should behave during and after the killings to support the cover narrative. The recordings prove that Manson was following orders from people much more powerful than himself, rather than acting on his own apocalyptic obsessions. The recordings also reveal discussions about how the investigation would be handled, what evidence would be suppressed, and how the media narrative would be managed to ensure that the real conspiracy remained hidden. The conversations include references to specific law enforcement officials, prosecutors, and journalists who were expected to cooperate with the cover-up. These recordings were classified at the highest levels of government secrecy and have never been released or even officially acknowledged to exist. They remain locked in federal archives under national security classifications that prevent their disclosure even under Freedom of Information Act requests. The trial of Charles Manson and his followers was carefully orchestrated to prevent any of this evidence from being presented to the jury or becoming public knowledge. The prosecution's case was built entirely around the testimony of Linda Kasabian, a member of the Manson family, who had been granted immunity in exchange for her cooperation with the official narrative. Kasabian's testimony was extensively coached by prosecutors and federal agents to ensure that she would support the helter-skelter story while omitting any information about the real planning and financing of the murders. She was provided with detailed scripts about what to say and what not to say, and she was threatened with prosecution for perjury if she deviated from the approved narrative. Kasabian knew about the payments that had been made to the family and about the meetings between Manson and his handlers from criminal organizations and intelligence agencies. She had witnessed conversations in which the real motives for the murders were discussed, and she understood that the killings were business decisions rather than expressions of apocalyptic ideology. But Kasabian was also made to understand that revealing this information would not only result in her own prosecution, but would also put her family at risk of violence from the same criminal networks that had ordered the original murders. She was convinced that cooperating with the cover-up was the only way to protect herself and her children from being killed. The defense attorneys who were assigned to represent Manson and the other defendants were carefully selected to ensure that they would not seriously challenge the prosecution's narrative or attempt to expose the real conspiracy. Attorneys who might have been effective in revealing the truth were either excluded from the case or pressured to withdraw from representation. Irving Kanarek, who served as Manson's attorney during much of the trial, was more interested in creating a circus atmosphere than in presenting a serious defense. His bizarre behavior and rambling arguments served to reinforce the image of Manson as a deranged cult leader, while making it impossible for any coherent alternative theory of the case to be presented to the jury. The other defendants were represented by attorneys who were either incompetent or compromised by their own connections to the criminal networks involved in the case. These attorneys failed to investigate obvious leads, failed to challenge contradictory evidence, and failed to present alternative theories that could have exposed the real conspiracy. When defense attorneys did attempt to introduce evidence about the real conspiracy, they were blocked by judicial rulings that prevented them from presenting information about the victims' connections to criminal activities or about the financial backing that the Manson family had received from organized crime figures. Judge Charles Older, who presided over the trial, was himself connected to intelligence agencies and had been briefed on the national security implications of the case. He understood that his job was to ensure that the trial resulted in convictions based on the official narrative while preventing exposure of information that could compromise ongoing intelligence operations. The prosecution team was led by Vincent Bugliosi, who later wrote the best-selling book Helter Skelter that cemented the official narrative in popular culture. But Bugliosi wasn't just trying to win convictions against the defendants. He was actively participating in a cover-up operation designed to protect criminal networks and intelligence agencies from exposure. Bugliosi knew that the helter-skelter motive was nonsensical and that the real reasons for the murders were much more specific and rational. He had access to evidence that proved the murders were targeted assassinations ordered by criminal organizations, but he chose to suppress this evidence in favor of a narrative that served the interests of his federal handlers. The helter-skelter theory was constructed to provide an explanation for the murders that would satisfy public curiosity while directing attention away from the real perpetrators and their motives. The theory was designed to be sensational enough to capture media attention while being bizarre enough to discourage serious investigation of alternative explanations. Bugliosi's book became a bestseller precisely because it provided a satisfying narrative that allowed readers to feel that they understood what had happened without challenging them to question the deeper corruption and criminality that actually motivated the murders. The book served as propaganda, designed to reinforce the cover-up while making its author wealthy and famous. The media coverage of the Manson trial was carefully managed to ensure that journalists would focus on the sensational aspects of the cult narrative while avoiding investigation of the evidence that contradicted the official story. Major news organizations received briefings from federal agencies about what aspects of the case were considered sensitive to national security. Journalists who attempted to investigate the connections between the victims and Hollywood's criminal networks found their stories killed by editors who had been pressured by powerful interests in the entertainment industry. Reporters who persisted in asking uncomfortable questions about the case were reassigned to other beats or found themselves unable to get their stories published. The entertainment industry itself played a crucial role in reinforcing the false narrative through movies, television shows, and documentaries that portrayed Manson as a charismatic cult leader who had convinced his followers to commit murder for apocalyptic reasons. These productions served as propaganda designed to prevent the public from questioning the official story or investigating alternative theories. Hollywood had obvious reasons to support the cover-up, because exposing the real conspiracy would have revealed the extensive criminal activities that were financing much of the industry's operations. The drug trafficking, Money laundering, prostitution, and blackmail networks that had ordered the murders were integral to the business model of many major entertainment companies. The success of the Manson cover-up established a template for similar operations that would be used repeatedly in subsequent decades. Whenever criminal organizations or intelligence agencies needed to eliminate threats while avoiding exposure, they could use the same combination of patsy selection, narrative construction, and institutional coordination that had been perfected during the Manson case. The techniques developed during the Manson cover-up were used in numerous other cases involving political assassinations, terrorist attacks, and mass casualty events that served the interests of powerful criminal and intelligence networks. The basic principles of selecting disturbed individuals as patsies, coaching them to commit crimes that could be blamed on their personal obsessions, and then using institutional power to suppress evidence of the real conspiracy became standard operating procedures. But the Manson case also created ongoing vulnerabilities for the people and organizations involved in the cover-up. Evidence of the real conspiracy continued to exist in various forms, and people who knew the truth continued to pose potential threats that needed to be managed through ongoing surveillance, intimidation, and occasionally violence. Over the years, several people who had information about the real motives for the Manson murders died in suspicious circumstances or were silenced through other means. The pattern of deaths was carefully managed to avoid creating obvious connections, but researchers who have studied the case have identified numerous suspicious deaths among people who had knowledge that could have exposed the conspiracy. The criminal networks that ordered the Manson murders didn't disappear after the trial ended. They evolved and expanded, using the profits from their illegal activities to gain even more power and influence in Hollywood and other industries. The same basic criminal enterprises that were operating in the late 1960s continued to operate for decades, protected by the same techniques of narrative control and evidence suppression. Many of the people who were involved in ordering and covering up the Manson murders went on to have extremely successful careers in entertainment, politics, and business. They used their knowledge of how to manipulate investigations and control narratives to protect themselves and their associates from accountability for numerous other crimes committed over the subsequent decades. The techniques they perfected were also exported internationally through intelligence cooperation agreements and criminal partnerships that allowed similar cover-up operations to be conducted in other countries. The Manson template became a standard tool for intelligence agencies and criminal organizations around the world who needed to eliminate threats while maintaining plausible deniability. The international influence of the Manson cover-up can be seen in numerous cases where similar techniques were used to frame patsies and hide real conspiracies. The basic methodology of creating false narratives, suppressing contradictory evidence, and using institutional power to control investigations has been replicated in cases involving terrorism, political violence, and organized crime throughout the world. But the Manson case also demonstrates that even the most sophisticated cover-up operations have limitations and vulnerabilities. Despite decades of narrative control and evidence suppression, enough information has survived to allow researchers to piece together the real story of what happened and why. The truth has a persistence that makes it difficult to suppress indefinitely, even when powerful interests are committed to hiding it. The people who were really responsible for ordering the Manson murders are mostly dead now, but the criminal enterprises and institutional systems they created continue to operate. The same networks of corruption, the same techniques of manipulation and control, and the same willingness to use violence to protect illegal activities continue to influence American politics, business, and entertainment. Understanding the real story of the Manson murders is important not just for historical accuracy, but for understanding how power operates in contemporary America. The techniques that were used to cover up these crimes are still being used to cover up crimes today. The networks of corruption that ordered these murders evolved into the networks that continue to shape major institutions throughout American society. Don't forget to like this video if you're shocked by these revelations, and let me know in the comments whether you think the full truth about the Manson murders will ever be revealed. Because understanding how these cover-ups work is essential for recognizing when similar techniques are being used against us today. The victims of the Manson murders deserved better than to have their deaths used as cover for the very criminal activities that had marked them for elimination in the first place. Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, Stephen Parent, Leno LaBianca, and Rosemary LaBianca were all killed because they posed threats to powerful criminal enterprises, but their murders were used to create a false narrative that actually protected those same enterprises from exposure and prosecution. Sharon Tate was a young woman who was trying to protect her family from the criminal activities that her husband had become involved in. Her murder was used to create a sensational story about cult violence that distracted attention from the Hollywood corruption she had been threatening to expose. Instead of being remembered as someone who died trying to do the right thing, she became a symbol of the supposed dangers of 1960s counterculture. Jay Sebring was a successful businessman who had gotten involved in criminal activities but had become a liability to his criminal associates. His murder was portrayed as random cult violence rather than as the targeted assassination it actually was. His death served the interests of the same criminal networks that had been using his services and paying for his silence. Abigail Folger was a social justice activist who was using her wealth to support causes that threatened powerful criminal interests. Her murder was used to create a narrative about random violence against the wealthy, rather than acknowledging that she had been killed because of her specific political activities and the threats they posed to criminal enterprises. Wojciech Frykowski was a writer and filmmaker who was documenting criminal activities for a book that could have exposed major corruption in Hollywood. His murder was portrayed as the random killing of a drug user, rather than as the targeted elimination of someone who possessed dangerous information about powerful people. Stephen Parent was a young man who had been drawn into criminal activities as a courier and informant. His murder was used to support the narrative of random cult violence, rather than acknowledging that he had been killed to prevent him from providing testimony that could have exposed the real conspiracy behind the other murders. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were business people who had been involved in money laundering and other criminal activities but had become unreliable and potentially cooperative with law enforcement. Their murders were portrayed as random selections by crazed cult members rather than as targeted eliminations of people who posed specific threats to criminal enterprises. The Manson family members who were convicted of carrying out these murders were also victims of the conspiracy in their own way. Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Charles Tex Watson, and Leslie Van Houten were manipulated and used by people who had no intention of taking responsibility for the crimes they had ordered. These individuals spent their lives in prison for murders that were planned and financed by people who remained free and successful. Charles Manson himself was perhaps the ultimate victim of the conspiracy because his entire public identity was constructed around a false narrative that served the interests of the people who had used him as a patsy. He became one of the most famous criminals in American history, but almost everything that people think they know about him and his motives is based on lies that were created to protect the real conspirators. The continuing classification of evidence related to the Manson murders over 50 years after they occurred proves that the cover-up is still active and that powerful interests remain invested in preventing the truth from being revealed. Documents that could prove the real conspiracy remain locked in government archives under various classifications that prevent their release even under Freedom of Information Act requests. The fact that this evidence is still being protected proves that it exists and that it would be damaging to people and institutions that continue to operate today. If there really was nothing more to the Manson murders than a cult leader's apocalyptic fantasies, there would be no reason to continue hiding evidence about the case after more than half a century. The ongoing secrecy surrounding the case is itself evidence that the official story is false, and that the real story would implicate people and organizations that still have the power to suppress information and control narratives. The classification of evidence serves no legitimate national security purpose and exists only to protect criminal enterprises and corrupt institutions from accountability for historical crimes. The Manson murders case provides a perfect example of how false narratives can be constructed and maintained, even when they contradict obvious evidence and basic logic. The helter-skelter theory was so bizarre and implausible that it should have been rejected by anyone who examined it carefully, but it was successfully sold to the public because it was supported by law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, journalists, and entertainment industry figures who all had reasons to maintain the cover-up. This demonstrates the power of coordinated institutional lying and the difficulty that individual researchers face when trying to challenge official stories that are supported by multiple powerful organizations. When all major institutions promote the same false narrative, it becomes very difficult for alternative explanations to gain credibility or attention, even when they are supported by superior evidence. But the case also demonstrates that false narratives are ultimately unstable and vulnerable to exposure when enough people are willing to examine evidence critically and ask uncomfortable questions. The official story of the Manson murders has been maintained for over 50 years, but it is increasingly recognized as implausible by researchers who have taken the time to study the available evidence without being constrained by official narratives. The techniques that were used to construct and maintain the false Manson narrative are still being used today to cover up crimes and protect powerful interests. Citizens who want to understand how they are being manipulated and deceived need to study historical cases like the Manson murders that reveal how institutional coordination can be used to suppress truth and maintain false narratives. The real lesson of the Manson murders isn't that charismatic cult leaders can convince followers to commit terrible crimes for irrational reasons. The real lesson is that powerful criminal organizations can commit almost any crime as long as they have the resources to control how the crime is investigated, prosecuted, and explained to the public. This lesson is as relevant today as it was in 1969. The same techniques of narrative manipulation, evidence suppression, and institutional coordination that were used to cover up the real reasons for the Manson murders are still being used to cover up crimes committed by powerful people in politics, business, entertainment, and intelligence agencies. The ongoing classification of evidence related to the Manson case demonstrates how the passage of time can be used to justify continued secrecy about government and corporate crimes. Officials argue that crimes committed decades ago are no longer relevant to contemporary politics, but this argument ignores the continuing influence of the criminal networks and cover-up techniques that were developed during these historical cases. As long as evidence about the Manson murders remains classified, as long as the techniques used to cover up these crimes continue to be used against contemporary victims, and as long as the criminal networks that ordered these murders continue to operate under different names and leadership, these historical crimes remain contemporary political issues that demand resolution and accountability. The house on Cielo Drive, where Sharon Tate and 4 others were murdered, has been demolished and rebuilt multiple times, but the criminal enterprises that ordered their deaths continue to operate from offices and mansions throughout Hollywood. The specific individuals who planned these murders may be dead, but the institutions and networks they created have evolved and adapted to changing circumstances while maintaining their basic criminal objectives. Modern Hollywood continues to be shaped by many of the same criminal enterprises that were operating in 1969. Drug trafficking remains a major source of financing for independent films and a way for established figures to maintain influence in the industry. Money laundering operations disguised as film investments continue to allow organized crime figures to clean their profits while gaining control over legitimate businesses. High-end prostitution and blackmail operations continue to provide criminal networks with leverage over politicians, executives, and celebrities. The technology has evolved from photographs and audio recordings to digital surveillance and cyber blackmail, but the basic business model remains unchanged. Criminal organizations continue to use sexual compromises and financial crimes to control decision-making in the entertainment industry. The techniques of narrative control that were perfected during the Manson cover-up have become even more sophisticated and effective in the digital age. Social media platforms, streaming services, and online news sources provide criminal networks with unprecedented ability to shape public opinion and suppress inconvenient information. The same institutional coordination that was used to maintain the helter-skelter narrative is now being used to control information about contemporary crimes and conspiracies. Federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies continue to protect criminal enterprises that serve their operational needs, while prosecuting competitors and troublemakers who threaten established arrangements. The relationships between government agencies and criminal organizations that were revealed during the Manson case have evolved into even more sophisticated partnerships that allow both sides to pursue their objectives while maintaining plausible deniability. The entertainment industry's role in promoting false narratives and suppressing inconvenient truths has expanded far beyond movies and television shows. Streaming platforms, social media influencers, and online content creators all participate in coordinated campaigns designed to reinforce official stories while marginalizing alternative explanations. The propaganda techniques that were used to promote the helter-skelter narrative have been refined and expanded into comprehensive information warfare capabilities. But the digital age has also created new vulnerabilities for criminal networks and cover-up operations. Information that would have been impossible to preserve and distribute in 1969 can now be stored indefinitely and shared instantly with global audiences. Evidence that criminal organizations thought they had successfully suppressed can resurface decades later and reach millions of people within hours. The same technologies that enable more sophisticated propaganda and narrative control also enable more effective resistance and truth-telling. Independent researchers, citizen journalists, and activists now have access to tools and platforms that allow them to challenge official narratives and expose criminal activities without relying on traditional media gatekeepers. The Manson case has become a template for understanding how cover-up operations work, and this understanding has made it more difficult for similar operations to succeed in the contemporary environment. People who have studied the techniques used to frame Manson and suppress evidence about the real conspiracy are better equipped to recognize when similar techniques are being used in current cases. The growing awareness of how the Manson narrative was constructed and maintained has also contributed to broader skepticism about official explanations for major crimes and political events. Citizens who understand how institutional coordination can be used to suppress truth are less likely to accept official stories without demanding evidence and independent verification. This increased skepticism represents a threat to criminal networks and corrupt institutions that rely on public credulity to maintain their operations. The success of cover-up operations depends on the ability to control information and shape narratives. But this becomes much more difficult when large numbers of people understand how these techniques work and actively resist them. The response from criminal networks and corrupt institutions has been to develop even more sophisticated techniques of information control while also increasing the use of direct threats and violence against people who pose serious threats to their operations. The same willingness to use murder to protect criminal enterprises that was demonstrated in the Manson case continues to be deployed against contemporary truth-tellers and whistleblowers. But the multiplication of information sources and the global reach of digital communications has made it much more difficult to eliminate all evidence of criminal activities or to silence all potential witnesses. The techniques that were used to cover up the Manson murders would be much less effective today because of the changed information environment and the increased awareness of how cover-up operations work. This doesn't mean that criminal networks and corrupt institutions have become powerless or that justice will automatically prevail in contemporary cases. The same basic dynamics that allowed the Manson conspiracy to be covered up continue to operate today, and powerful interests continue to have enormous advantages in their ability to control investigations and shape narratives. But it does mean that maintaining false narratives requires much more effort and coordination than it did in 1969, and that cover-up operations face greater risks of exposure and failure than they did during the analog age. The Manson case serves as both a warning about how criminal conspiracies can be hidden and a guide for how citizens can work to expose the truth despite institutional resistance. The victims of the Manson murders deserve to have the truth about their deaths finally revealed, not just for the sake of historical accuracy, but as a matter of justice that transcends the passage of time. The criminal networks that ordered their murders have escaped accountability for over 50 years, but this doesn't mean that justice is impossible or that the truth will never be fully known. Every piece of evidence that is discovered, every false narrative that is challenged, and every institutional lie that is exposed contributes to a growing body of knowledge that makes it more difficult for criminal networks to operate with impunity. The truth about the Manson murders may have been suppressed for decades, but it has not been destroyed, and it continues to pose a threat to the people and organizations that have built their power on foundations of lies and violence. The continuing efforts by researchers, journalists, and activists to expose the truth about the Manson case serve a purpose that goes far beyond solving a historical mystery. These efforts contribute to a broader struggle against criminal networks and corrupt institutions that continue to threaten the safety and freedom of ordinary citizens. Understanding how the Manson murders were really planned and carried out, and how the subsequent cover-up was organized and maintained, provides insights that are directly relevant to contemporary struggles against organized crime, government corruption, and institutional lying. The techniques that were used in 1969 continue to be used today, and exposing historical applications of these techniques helps citizens recognize and resist their contemporary use. The Manson case also demonstrates that even the most powerful criminal conspiracies and sophisticated cover-up operations are ultimately vulnerable to persistent investigation and determined truth-telling. The people who ordered these murders and covered up the evidence believed that their secrets would remain hidden forever, but they underestimated the power of truth to survive and eventually emerge despite their best efforts to suppress it. This provides hope for contemporary victims of criminal conspiracies and government cover-ups who may feel that the forces arrayed against them are too powerful to overcome. The Manson case proves that criminal networks and corrupt institutions, no matter how powerful they appear, cannot control information indefinitely and cannot prevent the truth from eventually reaching people who are willing to hear it and act on it. The battle for truth about the Manson murders is part of a larger war between those who would use violence and deception to maintain power and those who demand accountability and transparency from all institutions, regardless of how powerful they claim to be. This war has been going on for centuries, but the stakes have never been higher, and the tools available to both sides have never been more powerful. The outcome of this war will determine whether future generations live in a world where criminal networks and corrupt institutions can commit any crime as long as they have sufficient power to control the narrative, or whether they live in a world where truth and justice ultimately prevail regardless of how long it takes or how much resistance they encounter. The Manson murders were a turning point in this struggle, demonstrating both the enormous power of coordinated institutional lying and the ultimate vulnerability of even the most sophisticated cover-up operations. The lessons learned from studying this case continue to inform contemporary struggles for truth and justice, and the evidence that has been uncovered continues to inspire new generations of researchers and activists who refuse to accept official lies, no matter how long they have been maintained. Subscribe if you want to see more investigations into the cases that powerful people have tried to bury, and let me know in the comments whether you think we'll ever see the full declassification of evidence related to the Manson murders. Because the fight for truth about this case is far from over, and every person who learns about the real conspiracy and shares that knowledge with others contributes to the eventual triumph of truth over the lies that have protected murderers and criminals for over 50 years. The real Charles Manson story isn't about a hippie cult that went wrong or a charismatic leader who convinced followers to commit senseless murders. It's about a sophisticated criminal conspiracy that used an expendable patsy to carry out targeted assassinations while creating a false narrative that protected the real perpetrators from accountability. It's about the power of institutional coordination to suppress truth and maintain lies for decades. And it's about the ultimate vulnerability of even the most powerful conspiracies to persistent investigation and determined truth-telling. Until the full truth about who ordered the Manson murders and why is revealed, until all classified evidence is released for public examination, and until the criminal networks that benefited from these crimes are exposed and dismantled, the Manson case will remain an open wound in American justice that continues to demand attention and resolution. But it will also remain a testament to the power of truth to survive even the most comprehensive efforts to bury it, and a promise that eventually justice will come for all victims of criminal conspiracy and government cover-up, no matter how long ago their murders occurred or how powerful their killers appeared to be. The house on Cielo Drive is gone, but the truth about what happened there on August 9, 1969, survives and continues to spread despite more than 50 years of efforts to suppress it. That truth will eventually reach enough people to make continued cover-up impossible, and when that happens, the real story of the Manson murders will finally be told in its entirety. And when that day comes, the victims will finally receive the justice they deserved, the real perpetrators will finally be exposed for what they were, and the American people will finally understand how they have been lied to and manipulated by institutions they were taught to trust. The truth about the Manson murders is coming, and when it arrives, it will change everything people think they know about crime, corruption, and conspiracy in America.